Sometimes a man's last chance looks like everybody else's worst mistake. When 63-year-old Amos Tyne spent his final $500 on a flood-ravaged ranch outside Broken Bluff, the whole town called him a fool. The land had been underwater for 2 straight seasons. Nothing remained but a rotting barn, a house wrapped in vines, and mud as far as the eye could see. But Amos had nowhere else to go, and his only companion was Clara, a stubborn old donkey who seemed to understand him better than most people ever did. What Amos found buried beneath that barn would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone who ever doubted that broken land could heal. What was hidden in that cellar for over a century? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra. Special for you. The wagon creaked under the meager weight of Amos Tyne's possessions as it rolled down the muddy trail toward what the county clerk had generously called the old winter's property. Behind him, Clara plodded along with her characteristic stubbornness, occasionally braying her opinion about the whole venture. If donkeys could talk, Amos figured Clara would have plenty to say about his decision-making lately. The spring sun hung low in the Colorado sky, casting long shadows across the flood-ravaged landscape. Water had receded only 3 weeks earlier, leaving behind a patchwork of mud, debris, and the skeletal remains of what had once been productive farmland. The Little Snake River had jumped its banks twice in as many years, and most folks had given up on this stretch of territory. Only a fool would try to make something of it now. Amos Tyne supposed that made him a fool then. He was 63 years old, with a back that complained every morning and hands that ached when rain was coming. His face was weathered brown as old leather, creased with lines that told stories of too much sun, too many hard seasons, and not enough laughter. What hair remained beneath his battered hat had gone silver-gray years ago. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned that rushing only brought regret. The ranch came into view as they rounded the last bend. Amos pulled the wagon to a stop and just sat there, taking it in. The barn listed slightly to the left, its red paint long since surrendered to wind and weather. The roof sagged in the middle like a swayback horse, but the structure still stood. Somehow, it had survived 2 floods that had taken down newer, sturdier buildings. The wood was dark with rot in places, and Amos could see gaps in the siding where the water had torn boards loose. But the bones were there. The foundation looked solid. The house was worse. 2 stories of faded clapboard wrapped in ivy and wild grapevines that had taken over like an invading army. The porch sagged, the windows were dark with grime, and the front door hung at an odd angle. But it had a roof, 4 walls, and a stone chimney that looked sound. Amos had lived in worse. Between the 2 buildings, mud stretched in every direction. The floodwaters had deposited layers of silt that would take months to clear. Debris littered the yard, broken fence posts, tangles of wire, pieces of furniture from who knew where. Even part of someone's chicken coop lodged against what remained of an old stone well. Clara brayed loudly, as if to say, "You cannot be serious." "I know what it looks like," Amos said, climbing down from the wagon. His boots squelched in the mud. "But it's ours. That counts for something. $500. Every last cent he had. He'd spent it on a handshake and a water-stained deed in the county clerk's office in Broken Bluff. The clerk, a nervous young man named Peterson, had tried to talk him out of it 3 different times. "Mr. Tyne, I have to tell you, this property's been underwater. Nobody's lived there in 20 years, even before the floods. The previous owner died back in 67, and it's just been sitting there ever since. You sure you wouldn't rather—" But Amos had already made up his mind. He needed land. He needed a place to stop running from his past and start facing whatever time he had left. And $500 was exactly what he had. The story of how Amos Tyne ended up with nothing but a donkey and a dream of rehabilitation was not a short one. But it could be summed up simply enough. Bad luck and worse choices. He'd been a ranch hand most of his life, working spreads across Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. Good with horses, reliable with cattle, steady in a crisis. For 30 years, he'd worked other men's land and saved his wages. Then he'd met Sarah Whitmore at a church social in Leadville, and something in his chest had shifted. She was a widow with gentle eyes and a laugh that made him feel young again. They married in the spring of 1880, and for 4 years, Amos had known what happiness felt like. They'd saved together, planning to buy their own small place. Just enough land for a modest herd and a garden. Sarah had wanted chickens. Amos could still hear her voice. A proper home needs chickens, Amos, and maybe a milk cow. Then Sarah took sick. The doctor said her heart was weak, something she'd been born with. She died in her sleep on a winter morning in 1884, and Amos's world had cracked right down the middle. He'd tried to keep going, spent their savings on her burial and a proper headstone. Went back to ranch work, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. He made mistakes, small ones at first, then larger. Got fired from 2 jobs in a row for showing up late, distracted. Started drinking more than was wise. Gambled away most of what little he had left on cards and horses. By 1888, he was drifting from town to town, taking odd jobs, sleeping in boarding houses, or sometimes in barns. That's where he'd found Clara, or rather, where Clara had found him. He'd been sleeping off a drunk in a stable outside Rawlins when he woke to find a donkey staring at him with large, solemn eyes. She was old even then, grey around the muzzle, with one ear that flopped sideways and a coat that had seen better days. The stable owner said she'd belonged to a prospector who died, and nobody wanted her. Too old for work, too ornery for most folks' patience. Well, Amos had said, reaching out to scratch her nose, I guess that makes 2 of us. He'd traded a week's work for Clara and a worn saddle blanket. That blanket, patched and repatched with mismatched fabric, now sat folded in his wagon. It wasn't much, but it was Clara's, and she seemed to take comfort in it. They'd been together ever since. 2 old souls with nowhere particular to go and all the time in the world to get there. Until 3 weeks ago, when Amos had walked into the county office in Broken Bluff, looking for work, and had seen the notice about the property auction. Tax sale, it said. Minimum bid $500. Located 8 miles south of town, flood damaged, sold as is. Something about it had called to him. Maybe it was the fact that $500 was almost exactly what he had left. Maybe it was the way the clerk had tried so hard to talk him out of it, as if the land itself was cursed. Or maybe it was just that Amos was tired of drifting, and this was his last chance to put down roots before the earth claimed him for good. Now here he stood, looking at his purchase in the harsh light of reality. The first person to comment on his wisdom, or lack thereof, was Henry Pruitt. Pruitt was a land speculator who'd made a modest fortune buying low and selling high. He showed up the next morning, riding a fine black horse and wearing a suit that cost more than Amos had paid for the entire ranch. Tyne, Pruitt said, not bothering to dismount. Heard you bought the Winters place. Mind if I ask what you were thinking? Thinking I needed land, Amos replied. He was standing in the barn doorway, assessing the damage. Got land. Got mud and rot, more like. Pruitt looked around with undisguised disdain. Listen, I'll make you an offer. I'll give you $600 for the property. That's $100 profit for 1 day's ownership. Can't beat that. Not interested in selling. $750 then. That's the best I'll do. Still not selling. Pruitt's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. This land is worthless. Always has been. There's a reason nobody's wanted it for 20 years. Then why do you want to buy it? Pruitt's jaw tightened. Just trying to help out an old-timer who don't know what he's got himself into. But if you want to be stubborn about it, that's your business. He wheeled his horse around. You'll come crawling back when you realize what a disaster you've bought. Mark my words. After Pruitt left, Amos returned to examining the barn. Clara stood nearby, munching on a patch of grass that had survived the flood. What do you think, girl? Is he right? Am I just an old fool? Clara flicked her tail and kept eating. Amos took that as a vote of confidence. By afternoon, he'd met more of Broken Bluff's citizens. Sheriff Dutch Keller rode out to introduce himself, a big man with a grey mustache and eyes that had seen enough of life to be skeptical but not unkind. Name's Keller, he said, shaking Amos's hand. Just wanted to make sure you're settling in all right. Henry Pruitt stopped by my office, said you might be squatting. Got a deed, Amos said. All legal. Figured as much. Pruitt tends to see problems where there aren't any, especially when he wants something. Keller looked around the property. You really planning to make something of this? Planning to try? Well, you've got more optimism than sense, but I respect that. Keller tipped his hat. You need anything, town's 8 miles north. My office is right on Main Street. The last visitor that first day was Martha Connolly, who ran the general store in Broken Bluff. She arrived in a buggy, bringing a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Thought you might be hungry, she said. She was somewhere in her 60s, with silver hair pinned up neat and a face that had laugh lines around the eyes. I'm Martha. I heard about your purchase from Peterson at the county office. He's my nephew. The basket contained fresh bread, cheese, apples, and a jar of preserves. It was more kindness than Amos had received in years. That's very generous, he said. What do I owe you? Nothing. It's a welcome gift. She glanced at the house and barn. Quite a project you've taken on. Some folks think I'm crazy. Some folks think anybody who does anything different is crazy. She smiled. My late husband Thomas bought a failing mercantile 40 years ago. Everyone said he was throwing money away. He built it into the most successful business in 3 counties. Sometimes the thing everybody else has given up on is exactly what needs someone willing to try. Her words stayed with Amos long after she drove away. He spent his first night in the house, wrapped in a bedroll on the floor of what had once been a parlor. The place smelled of mold and abandonment, but the roof didn't leak and the walls kept out the wind. Clara was tied up outside with fresh water and hay. Tomorrow he'd start on the barn, get it sound enough for Clara to have proper shelter. Then he'd work on the house, then maybe start clearing the fields. It would take years, probably. He might not even live long enough to see it through. But Sarah had always said a man needed purpose. Idle hands make for a troubled heart, she used to say. As Amos drifted off to sleep, he thought about the land's history. The Winters property, they called it. He'd asked Martha about it before she left. Dr. Samuel Winters owned it originally, she'd said. Back in the 60s, right after the war. He was here for a couple years, then vanished. Nobody really knows what happened to him. Some say he went back east. Others say he died out here somewhere and nobody found him. The land's just been sitting ever since. A mystery then. This place had stories buried in it, just like Amos had stories buried in him. Maybe they'd figure each other out. 3 days of hard work had taught Amos Tyne that flood damage was worse than it looked from a distance. The barn's foundation was sound, but the floor had rotted through in several places. He'd spent 2 days hauling out debris, broken tools, waterlogged hay bales that had turned to compost, pieces of harness that crumbled when he touched them. The work was slow. His back complained every time he bent over, and his hands, scarred from years of ranch work, protested when he gripped the shovel for too long. But there was something satisfying about it. Each bucketful of mud hauled out was progress. Each rotten board removed meant he could replace it with something sound. Clara had taken to following him around, which wasn't like her. Normally she was content to graze or doze in the sun. But since they'd arrived at the ranch, she'd become almost clingy, staying close to Amos as he worked. He found it oddly comforting. At least somebody wanted his company. On the 3rd afternoon, Amos was working in the northeast corner of the barn, clearing away the last of the debris, when Clara started acting strange. She pawed at the floorboards with her front hoof, snorting and tossing her head. Then she'd stop, look at Amos, and paw again. What's got into you, girl? Amos straightened up, pressing a hand to his lower back. You see a snake? Clara brayed, a long, insistent sound, and pawed harder at the same spot. Amos walked over, curious now. The floorboards there looked no different from the others. Weathered pine, darkened with age, some warped from moisture. But when he knelt down and pressed his hand against the wood, something felt off. He knocked on the board. It sounded hollow. Frowning, Amos knocked on the adjacent boards. They made the solid thunk of wood backed by earth. But this one, and the 2 next to it, rang hollow. Clara snorted again, as if to say, finally. Took you long enough. Amos fetched his crowbar from the wagon. The boards resisted at first, nails screaming as he pried them up, but they were old and the wood was soft. The first plank came loose with a crack that sent dust motes spinning in the shaft of sunlight from the barn's open door. Underneath was darkness. Amos's heart began to beat faster. He pulled up the second board, then the third. The opening was about 4 feet square. He could see wooden steps leading down into blackness, a root cellar, hidden under the barn floor. He'd heard of such things, secret storage spaces where folks kept food safe from floods and vermin, or sometimes valuables safe from thieves. But he'd never actually seen one concealed this well. Amos retrieved his lantern from the wagon, lit it, and approached the opening carefully. The steps looked sound, made from different wood than the barn itself. Newer, or at least better preserved. He tested the first step with his weight. It held firm. "You stay here," he told Clara. "If I fall through and break my fool neck, you go fetch the sheriff." Clara's expression suggested she thought he was being dramatic. The steps led down about 8 feet. The air grew cooler as Amos descended, and his lantern revealed a space roughly 12 feet square, with walls made of fitted stone and a ceiling of thick timber beams. The floor was hard-packed earth, completely dry. How had this place stayed dry through 2 floods? The rest of the barn had been under 3 feet of water, according to the county records. But this cellar showed no signs of moisture damage at all. Along one wall sat a row of wooden crates, 6 of them, varying in size, all sealed tight. In the opposite corner, what looked like old furniture covered with canvas tarps. And on the back wall, shelves that held glass jars, empty now but arranged with careful precision. Amos approached the crates slowly, as if they might disappear if he moved too quickly. His hands trembled slightly as he set the lantern down and examined the nearest one. It was about 2 feet on each side, made of pine with rope handles. The lid was nailed shut, but not locked. Using the claw end of his crowbar, he carefully pried the lid loose. The nails gave way with squeaks of protest. Wood shavings and straw packed the interior. Amos brushed them aside and stopped breathing. Medical instruments, gleaming in the lamplight, as if they'd been placed there yesterday. Scalpels with ivory handles, a bone saw with a polished wooden grip, forceps of various sizes, small bottles still containing liquid, chloroform, the labels said in faded script. Rolls of linen bandages, yellowed but intact. A leather-bound book with surgical procedures field manual, 1863, embossed on the cover. Amos lifted out a scalpel. The blade was still sharp. On the handle, engraved in delicate script, were the initials S.W. Samuel Winters, the doctor who'd owned this land. His mind raced. Why would a doctor hide his medical kit in a secret cellar? And not just hide it, preserve it so carefully that it survived decades untouched. With shaking hands, Amos opened the second crate. More medical supplies, surgical tools he couldn't name, vials of medicine with labels too faded to read. Everything packed with the same meticulous care. The third crate was heavier. When he lifted the lid, candlelight glinted off metal, but not the bright gleam of surgical steel. This was duller, older silver coins. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, packed in leather pouches. Amos picked up one pouch and loosened the drawstring. Liberty-seated dollars spilled into his palm, dated from the early 1860s. Each one was worth face value, but as antiques, they'd be worth much more. His breath came faster. This was real money. More money than he'd seen in his entire life. He stopped himself. Put the coins back carefully. Closed the crate. This wasn't his, not yet. Not until he understood what it was and why it was here. He spent another hour in the cellar, examining everything with growing wonder. The crates held a fortune in historical artifacts and silver, but they also held questions. Why had Dr. Winters hidden all this? What had happened to make him seal these things away so carefully? When Amos finally climbed back up into the barn, the sun was setting. Clara stood exactly where he'd left her, as if she'd been standing guard. "You knew," Amos said, scratching between her ears. "Somehow, you knew something was down there." Clara nuzzled his shoulder. That night, Amos couldn't sleep. He lay on his bedroll in the house, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the cellar. He should tell someone. The sheriff, maybe. Or Martha, she knew the town's history. But something held him back. Once word got out, everything would change. People would come, ask questions, make demands. Henry Pruitt would probably triple his offer for the property. No, first, Amos needed to understand what he'd found, needed to learn the story behind it. The next morning, he was awakened by someone pounding on the door. He opened it to find Henry Pruitt standing on the sagging porch, looking agitated. "I heard something interesting in town yesterday," Pruitt said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Someone said they saw you hauling crates out of the barn. Said you looked excited." Amos kept his expression neutral. "Been hauling a lot of things out of that barn. Mostly mud and rot. I want to see inside the barn. No, I have a right. You have no rights on my property. You made that clear when you said the place was worthless." Pruitt's face reddened. "Listen here, old man. If you've found something valuable on that land, you need to declare it. There are laws about treasure troves. Haven't found any treasure. Just a lot of work." Amos stepped back and closed the door. Through the window, he watched Pruitt stand there for a long moment before stalking back to his horse. That afternoon, Sheriff Keller rode out. Unlike Pruitt, he was polite. "Henry Pruitt filed a complaint," Keller said, leaning against his horse. "Says you're hiding something. Says there might be valuable property that belongs to the territory. There's nothing here but an old barn and a stubborn donkey," Amos said. But he could tell Keller didn't quite believe him. "Look, Amos, I like you. You seem like a decent man. But if you have found something, artifacts, money, whatever, you need to be careful." Word's already spreading. "There are people who'd think nothing of coming out here at night to look around. If you know what I mean. I'll keep that in mind." After Keller left, Amos sat on the porch steps, watching the sun set over his mud-covered land. Clara stood nearby, contentedly chewing on a patch of prairie grass. Everything had changed in the space of one afternoon. 3 days ago, he'd been a nobody with a worthless piece of flood-damaged property. Now he was sitting on a secret that could change his life or complicate it beyond measure. The smart thing would be to sell everything. Take the money and disappear. Buy a small place somewhere quiet. Live out his days in peace. But that's not what Sarah would have wanted. She'd always said a man's character showed in what he did when nobody was watching. And right now, nobody was watching except Clara. "We're going to figure out this mystery," Amos told the donkey. "We're going to find out who Dr. Winters was and why he left all this behind. And then we'll decide what's right to do with it," Clara brayed softly. And Amos chose to interpret that as agreement. Amos spent the next morning in the cellar, examining the medical kit by lamplight with a reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. Each instrument told a story, though he didn't yet know how to read it. The bone saw felt heavy in his hands. He imagined a surgeon using it on a battlefield, working against time to save a soldier's life. The blade still held its edge after all these years. The wooden handle was smooth, worn by grip and use. On the metal, just above where the blade met the handle, those initials again, SW, every piece bore the same mark. The scalpels, the forceps, the surgical scissors, each one engraved with Samuel Winters' initials. This wasn't just a doctor's kit. It was a craftsman's tools, carefully chosen and maintained. The man who owned these instruments had taken pride in his work. Among the surgical tools, Amos found something that puzzled him. A second, smaller kit packed in oilcloth. When he unwrapped it, he found more instruments, but these were different, cruder. The handles weren't ivory, but plain wood. The metal wasn't as fine, and the case itself was marked with a faded stamp. CSA Medical Corps, Confederate States of America. Amos sat back on his heels, frowning. Dr. Winters had been Union Army, according to the records Martha had mentioned. So why did he have Confederate medical supplies? There were other mysteries in the crates. A leather satchel contained personal items. A woman's silver locket with a broken chain. A child's toy soldier made of tin. A pocket watch that no longer ran. The watch was inscribed on the back, "To Samuel, with love eternal, Elizabeth." Elizabeth. Dr. Winters had been married then. Where was his wife now? What had happened to his family? The deeper Amos dug, the more questions emerged. And with each question, his sense that this discovery meant something important grew stronger. Around noon, he cleaned up and rode Clara into Broken Bluff. He needed information, and Martha Connolly's general store seemed like the place to start. The town itself was modest, a single main street with false-fronted buildings, a church with a white steeple, and the usual collection of businesses that kept a frontier town alive. Martha's store sat at the center of it all, a two-story structure with Connolly Mercantile painted in neat letters above the door. Martha looked up from her counter when the bell above the door jangled. "Amos, didn't expect to see you so soon. How's the ranch coming along?" "Slowly but surely." He approached the counter, removing his hat. "Actually, I was hoping you might help me with something. You mentioned Dr. Winters the other day. I'd like to know more about him." Martha's expression grew thoughtful. "Dr. Winters. Now there's a name I haven't heard much in recent years. What specifically would you like to know?" "Anything you can tell me. When he lived here, what he did, what happened to him." "Well, let me think." Martha moved to a corner of the store where newspapers were stacked. "I keep the old editions. My late husband was a collector of local history. Let me see if I can find anything." She pulled down several bound volumes of the Broken Bluff Gazette, dating back to the 1860s. Together, they spread them across a table near the window. "Here," Martha said, pointing to a brief notice from October 1865. "This is the first mention of him. Dr. Samuel Winters, late of the Union Army Medical Corps, has purchased property 8 miles south of town. The doctor intends to establish a homestead and may provide medical services to the community as needed. So he came right after the war ended," Amos mused. "Seems so." Martha turned pages carefully. "Here's another one from December 1865. Dr. Winters treated young Timothy Halstead for a broken arm. The boy's father reports the doctor refused payment, saying he was grateful to be of service to the community." They found a few more mentions over the next hour. Dr. Winters, helping with a difficult childbirth. In the winter of 1866, Dr. Winters donating medical supplies to the church for distribution to needy families. Dr. Winters, present at the founding of the town school. He sounds like he was well regarded, Amos said. He was. My husband's father knew him briefly. Said he was a quiet man, kept to himself mostly, but was always willing to help when called upon. Martha paused. "But here's where it gets strange." She pointed to a newspaper from April 1867. The headline read, "Local Doctor Vanishes, Foul Play. Suspected." The article was longer than the previous mentions. It described how Dr. Winters had been seen in town purchasing supplies on April 12, 1867, and then was never seen again. His horse and wagon were found abandoned on the road between town and his property. The house appeared undisturbed, but the doctor was gone. They searched for weeks, Martha said. Sheriff at the time, my husband's uncle, organized search parties. They combed the whole area. Never found a body, never found any sign of what happened to him. What did people think? Theories ranged from wild animals to robbery, to him simply deciding to leave. But his belongings were still at the house. His horse and wagon were there. It didn't make sense that he'd just walk away from everything. Amos thought about the sealed crates in the cellar, preserved so carefully. Did he have family? The article mentions a wife and daughter, but says they died of cholera during the journey west. That's one of the reasons people found his disappearance so troubling. He'd already lost his family. What reason would he have to vanish? They searched through more papers, but found no resolution to the mystery. Dr. Samuel Winters had simply disappeared, and over time, people had stopped asking questions. The property sat empty for years, Martha said. The county took it over for unpaid taxes in the 1870s. It's changed hands a few times since then, but nobody ever stayed long. Floods mostly. The Little Snake River has never been kind to that stretch of land. Amos thanked Martha and purchased some supplies. Coffee, flour, beans, and a new lantern. As he was preparing to leave, she put a hand on his arm. Amos, why the sudden interest in Dr. Winters? He hesitated. Martha had been kind to him, and he didn't like lying, but he wasn't ready to reveal what he'd found. Not yet. Just curious about the land's history, he said finally. Seems like I ought to know about the man who built the place I'm trying to restore. Martha studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. Well, if you find anything interesting in that old barn, you'll let me know, won't you? I do love a good mystery. You'll be the first to know, Amos promised. On the ride back to the ranch, Amos's mind churned. Dr. Winters had been a respected man, a healer who helped people freely. He'd lost his family to disease, and then he'd disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a fortune in medical instruments and silver coins hidden in a secret cellar. None of it made sense. Unless, what if Dr. Winters hadn't disappeared at all? What if he'd left on purpose, staging his own vanishing? But why would a man do that? What could drive someone to abandon a life they'd built, to leave behind everything? When he got back to the ranch, Henry Pruitt was waiting. This time he wasn't alone. Two men stood beside him, rough-looking fellows with the kind of eyes that suggested they'd been on the wrong side of the law more than once. Amos Tyne, Pruitt said, his voice cold. I'm making you one final offer. $10,000 for the property. That's more than generous for land that's barely worth the mud it's sitting on. $10,000. It was a fortune. More money than Amos would see in 3 lifetimes of ranch work. He looked at Pruitt's cold eyes, at the hired men standing behind him, and understood. Pruitt knew, or suspected. He knew there was something valuable on this land. Not selling, Amos said. You're making a serious mistake. Maybe. But it's my mistake to make. Pruitt's jaw tightened. Don't say I didn't warn you, old man. He mounted his horse and rode off, his men following. That night Amos didn't sleep in the house. He took his bedroll into the barn, positioning himself where he could see the concealed entrance to the cellar. Clara stood in the corner, awake and alert. If someone came looking for what he'd found, they'd have to go through him first. And maybe that made him a fool. Maybe he should have taken Pruitt's money and walked away. But Sarah's voice whispered in his memory, a man's character shows in what he does when nobody's watching. Someone was watching now. Amos could feel it. The whole town would soon know he'd found something. But he was going to see this through. Going to learn the truth about Dr. Samuel Winters and why a good man had felt the need to hide his life's work and vanish into history. Whatever the answer was, it lay buried in that cellar. And Amos Tyne was going to find it. The silver coins kept Amos awake most of the night. Not because of their value, though that was considerable, but because of what they represented. A man didn't hide a fortune like that unless he had good reason. And a doctor who'd dedicated himself to helping people, who'd refused payment for his services, didn't seem like the type to hoard wealth in a secret cellar. By morning light, Amos was back in the cellar, examining the 3rd crate more carefully. The leather pouches were well made, each one stamped with a date and location. Philadelphia, 1863. There were 20 pouches in total, each containing between 10 and 15 Liberty-seated dollars. Amos's rough count put the total at nearly 300 coins. At face value, that was $300. A respectable sum in the 1860s, enough to buy a good-sized ranch. But these coins were now antiques, rare pieces from the Civil War era. A collector would pay many times their face value. Amos had seen similar coins advertised in old newspapers for $50 each or more. He was sitting on a fortune. Enough money to restore the ranch 10 times over. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of his days, with plenty left over. But something felt wrong about it. This money had belonged to Samuel Winters, a man who'd apparently cared little for wealth. Why had he hidden it so carefully? Why not spend it on his homestead, on helping others, on the medical practice he might have established? Amos replaced the coins carefully and turned his attention to the smaller items he'd noticed before. The silver locket opened to reveal 2 miniature portraits, a woman with gentle eyes and dark hair, and a young girl with the same eyes. Elizabeth and Rebecca, he assumed. The doctor's lost family. The toy soldier was worn smooth in places, as if a child's hands had held it often. One of the soldier's arms was bent at an odd angle, probably from being dropped or stepped on. Somehow that small imperfection made it more precious. This had been loved, played with, treasured, and the pocket watch, with its inscription, "To Samuel, with love eternal, Elizabeth." The watch was gold, beautifully engraved with a floral pattern. It had stopped at precisely 3:47, morning or evening, Amos couldn't tell. But that frozen moment felt significant, like a memory captured in brass and crystal. These weren't the possessions of a man planning to disappear. These were mementos, things a person kept close to remember what mattered most. If Dr. Winters had planned to leave and start over somewhere else, wouldn't he have taken these with him? Unless he'd meant for someone to find them eventually. Unless this was a time capsule, a message in a bottle sent forward through the years. But what was the message? Amos heard Clara bray from above. "Company coming?" He climbed the ladder quickly, replaced the floorboards, and scattered some debris over them. By the time Sheriff Keller rode up, Amos was outside, appearing to work on reinforcing the barn's doorframe. "Morning, Amos," Keller said, dismounting. "Got a minute?" "Always got time for the law." Keller looked around the property, taking in the work Amos had done. "Place is looking better already. You're making progress. Slow and steady. Listen, I'll be straight with you. Henry Pruitt came by my office again. He's convinced you've found something valuable. Now, normally I'd tell a man like Pruitt to mind his own business, but he's got connections in the territorial government. He's talking about filing legal challenges, claiming there might be historical artifacts that belong to the territory." "Historical artifacts," Amos repeated. "Like what?" "That's what I'm asking you." Amos met the sheriff's eyes. Keller was a fair man, he could tell. Not corrupt like some lawmen Amos had known. But he was also sworn to uphold the law, which meant if there was a legal question about property found on the land, Keller would have to act on it. "I've found some old tools," Amos said carefully. "Junk, mostly. Nothing worth Pruitt's interest. See, that's the thing. If it's junk, why does he care so much?" Keller pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket. "He's offered me $1,000 to deputize someone to search your property. I told him no, but he's not giving up. $1,000 just to search." Which meant Pruitt thought there was something worth much more than that on the property. "I appreciate the warning," Amos said. Keller nodded slowly. "I'm going to give you some advice, Amos. Man to man, not sheriff to citizen. Whatever you've found, be careful. Pruitt's the type who doesn't take no for an answer. And word's spreading. By tomorrow, half the territory will have heard rumors about treasure at the old Winters place. I can handle myself. I'm sure you can. But handle yourself with a loaded rifle close by, just in case." Keller mounted his horse. "And if you do find something that might be of historical significance, you let me know. Better to handle it official than have Pruitt and his lawyers making trouble." After Keller left, Amos sat on the porch steps, thinking. Clara ambled over and nuzzled his shoulder. "We've got a problem, girl," he said. "We've got something valuable, and now everybody knows it. Or thinks they do. He needed help. Someone he could trust. Someone who understood history and might help him make sense of what he'd found. Martha was the obvious choice, but bringing her into this would put her at risk too. Then again, she'd already expressed interest in the mystery of Dr. Winters, and she had access to town records, old newspapers, documents that might shed light on the doctor's life. Amos made his decision. That afternoon, he rode back to Broken Bluff. This time, he brought one of the leather pouches concealed in his saddlebag. When he entered the mercantile, Martha was helping a customer. He waited until they were alone. "Martha, I need your help with something. Something important." She looked at him carefully. "This is about what you found, isn't it?" "How did you—" "Amos, I've lived in this town for 40 years. I know when something's stirring people up. Henry Pruitt's been asking questions, making calls to Denver. Half the gossips in town are speculating about what you discovered. So yes, I know you found something." Amos glanced at the door, making sure they were alone. Then he pulled out the pouch and set it on the counter. This was in a hidden cellar under the barn. Martha opened the pouch and her eyes widened. "Good Lord, these are Civil War era. Mint condition. Where did you— How many of these do you have?" "About 300 coins, plus medical instruments from the same period." And personal effects. He kept his voice low. Martha, I need to understand what happened to Dr. Winters. These things were hidden deliberately, preserved carefully. This wasn't someone running away. This was someone leaving a message. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she examined the coins. These could be worth a small fortune. I'm not interested in selling them. I want to know the truth. She looked up at him, and something in her expression softened. You're a good man, Amos Tyne. Most people would have sold everything and disappeared by now. Most people didn't. Make a promise to themselves about living with integrity. He thought of Sarah. I need to do this right. What do you need from me? Access to any records about Dr. Winters, property transfers, tax documents, anything that might tell us more about his life here. And discretion. The fewer people who know the details, the better. Martha nodded. My nephew works at the county office, remember? I can get access to the records, and I know how to keep a secret. She paused. But Amos, you need to be careful. If these coins are worth what I think they're worth, there are people who would hurt you to get them, I know. That night, after returning to the ranch, Amos found signs that someone had been on the property. Bootprints in the mud near the barn, different from his own. Fresh marks where someone had tried to pry open the barn door. He loaded his rifle and slept in the barn again, Clara standing watch in her own way. Around midnight he heard horses approaching. He moved to the door, rifle ready. 3 riders circled the barn once, then rode off without dismounting. A message? We know you're here, we know what you have, and we're watching. Amos didn't sleep the rest of that night. He sat with his back against the concealed cellar entrance, thinking about Dr. Samuel Winters, a man who'd healed soldiers on both sides of a terrible war, a man who'd lost his family but continued trying to help others, a man who'd hidden his most precious possessions, not because he was greedy, but because he'd known someone would come looking, someone who wanted what he had, not for the right reasons, but for profit. And he'd protected his things the only way he knew how. As dawn broke over the ranch, Amos made a decision. He wasn't going to run, wasn't going to sell. He was going to see this through, going to learn the truth. And then he was going to honor Dr. Winters' memory the way it deserved to be honored, even if it meant standing alone against those who saw only dollar signs where he saw human dignity. The journal was tucked beneath a false bottom in the 4th crate, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax that had cracked with age, but still protected what lay within. Amos found it 3 days after his conversation with Martha, during yet another systematic search of the cellar's contents. The leather binding was worn but intact, the pages yellowed but still legible. On the inside cover, written in careful script, Dr. Samuel Winters' personal journal, April 1862 to November 1863. Amos carried the journal up into the barn, where the morning light was better, settled himself on an overturned crate, and began to read. Clara stood nearby, as if understanding the importance of what was about to unfold. The first entry was dated April 15th, 1862. Written in Philadelphia, Elizabeth presented me with this journal today, on the eve of my departure to join the Union Medical Corps. She said every man should record his experiences during times of great change, so that when peace returns, he might reflect on who he was and who he became. Rebecca added a drawing on the first page. A flower, she said, to remind me that beauty survives even in darkness. How can I leave them? Yet how can I not serve when so many need healing? Amos turned the page carefully. There was the drawing, a child's rendering of a flower, the lines wobbly but earnest. He touched it gently, thinking of the toy soldier in the cellar below. The entries that followed chronicled Dr. Winters' journey to join the Army of the Potomac, his assignment to a field hospital near Washington, his first experiences treating wounded soldiers after the Battle of Shiloh. The prose was measured, thoughtful, and increasingly haunted. May 1862. Today I amputated 7 limbs. 7 men who will return home altered if they return at all. The wounds are terrible, not clean cuts but shattered bone and torn flesh from the mini-balls. I try to be swift, to minimize suffering, but I hear their screams in my sleep. The ones I cannot save haunt me more than the ones I do. As Amos read, a picture emerged of a conscientious doctor struggling with the reality of war. Dr. Winters wrote about the shortage of supplies, the primitive conditions, the endless stream of casualties. But he also wrote about small victories, a soldier who survived against odds, an infection prevented through careful cleaning, moments of humanity amid carnage. Then came an entry from July 1862 that made Amos sit up straighter. Today, I was reprimanded by Colonel Hastings for treating Confederate prisoners. 3 wounded men were brought in after a skirmish, bleeding and in agony. I tended to them after seeing to our own men. The colonel said I was wasting valuable supplies on enemies. I told him the Hippocratic Oath makes no distinction between Union and Confederate, that a doctor's duty is to heal. He threatened to have me court-martialed if it happens again. What has become of us when mercy is considered treason? Amos flipped through more pages, watching the conflict deepen. Dr. Winters continued treating wounded soldiers from both sides, doing so quietly and often at night. He wrote about the contradiction of being a Union officer while believing that suffering transcended politics. September 1862. I have begun keeping. Confederate medical supplies separate from our own stores. When I treat Southern prisoners, I use their own equipment when possible. This way, if questioned, I can honestly say I am not depleting Union resources. It is a small deception, but one that allows me to follow my conscience, while avoiding court-martial. So, that explained the Confederate medical kit. Dr. Winters had acquired it to protect himself while doing what he believed was right. The journal entries grew darker as the war progressed. Dr. Winters wrote about letters from Elizabeth, worried about his safety and his state of mind. He wrote about Rebecca's birthday, which he missed, about the guilt of being away from his family, about wondering if healing a few hundred men mattered when thousands died each day. Then came October 1863. I received word today that threatens to undo me entirely. Colonel Hastings has learned of my continued treatment of Confederate wounded. He plans to bring charges against me, not just reprimand, but formal court-martial for providing aid and comfort to the enemy. I could face imprisonment or worse. More troubling, he has threatened to investigate my sympathies, suggesting that I might be a Southern spy. This is madness. I've saved Union soldiers by the score, but in Hastings' eyes, showing compassion to the enemy is treasonous. Amos read faster now, sensing the story approaching a crisis. November 1863. I have made my decision. I cannot in good conscience stop treating the wounded, regardless of their uniform. But neither can I allow myself to be destroyed by court-martial, leaving Elizabeth and Rebecca without support. I have requested a medical discharge on grounds of exhaustion and nervous strain, which is not entirely false. I've seen too much death. If the discharge is approved, I will return home and perhaps establish a private practice far from this war. The journal entries ended abruptly in late November 1863. The final entry read simply, "Discharge approved. I leave for Philadelphia tomorrow. May God forgive me if this is cowardice, but I can serve no further in an army that punishes mercy. I will heal in other ways." Amos closed the journal and sat in silence. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Dr. Winters had left the army, not because he was a coward, but because his conscience wouldn't allow him to follow orders that violated his deepest beliefs. He'd returned to his family, planning to start over, but something had happened after that. The newspaper articles said Elizabeth and Rebecca had died of cholera during the journey west. Dr. Winters had arrived in Broken Bluff alone, a widower carrying the weight of losing his family. Why had he come west? Why not stay in Philadelphia, where he had connections and could establish a practice? Unless he was running from something or someone. Martha arrived at the ranch that afternoon, her buggy loaded with boxes of old records from the county office. She'd brought her nephew Peterson along to help carry them. "This is everything I could find related to Dr. Winters or the property," Martha said. "Tax records, land transfers, even some personal correspondence that was filed with the county for estate purposes." They spread the documents across the barn floor. For hours, they read through yellowed papers, piecing together the external facts of Dr. Winter's life in Colorado. Peterson found something interesting in the tax records. Look at this. Dr. Winters paid property taxes for 2 years, 1865 and 1866. But in 1867, the year he disappeared, he'd already paid the full year's taxes in January. That's odd. Most people paid quarterly or at harvest time. He was planning ahead, Amos said. Making sure the property was secure, Martha held up a piece of correspondence. This is a letter from Dr. Winters to the county clerk, dated March 1867. He's inquiring about the process for transferring property ownership. Says he may need to make arrangements for the land to pass to worthy hands, should circumstances require. He was preparing to disappear, Amos said. A month before he vanished, he was already planning it. But why? Peterson asked. What would make a man plan his own disappearance? Amos thought about the journal entries, about a doctor court-martialed for showing mercy. He was afraid someone was coming for him. Someone from his past. Martha nodded slowly. That would explain why he hid everything so carefully. He wanted to protect what mattered. His instruments, his personal items, even the money he'd saved from whoever was pursuing him. They searched through more documents, but found no direct evidence of who might have been after Dr. Winters. There were no threatening letters in the official records, no lawsuits, no arrest warrants. As the sun set and Martha prepared to leave, she turned to Amos. What will you do now? Keep looking. There has to be more. The journal I found only goes to 1863. There's 4 years missing, the years when he was here in Colorado. If he kept a journal during that time, it might explain everything. If it exists, it would have to be in the cellar, Martha said. You've searched thoroughly? I thought I had, but maybe I missed something. That night, Amos returned to the cellar with fresh determination. He examined every crate again, tapping on bottoms and sides, looking for more false compartments. He checked the stone walls for loose stones that might conceal a hiding place. He even examined the timber beams overhead. Nothing. Frustrated, he sat on the floor and looked around. Where would a careful, methodical man hide something precious? Somewhere that wouldn't be found by casual search, but somewhere that someone really looking, someone who cared about the truth, might eventually discover. His eyes fell on the original journal, which he'd brought down with him. He picked it up again, feeling the weight of it. The binding was thick, unusually thick. With trembling hands, Amos examined the spine more carefully. The leather was doubled over, stitched tight. But the stitching at one end looked different, newer, done with different thread. Someone had opened this binding and sewn it back up. Using his pocket knife, Amos carefully worked at the stitches. They came loose, easier than the others, confirming his suspicion. He opened the binding and felt inside. Papers, folded small and tucked into the hollow space between the leather and the spine. He pulled them out with shaking hands and unfolded them carefully. More journal entries written on loose sheets. The dates ran from 1865 to 1867, the missing years. And there, in Dr. Samuel Winter's careful script, was the truth he'd been searching for. Amos didn't sleep that night. He read the hidden pages by lamplight, and with each entry, the story of Dr. Samuel Winters transformed from mystery to tragedy to something more complex than either word could capture. The first hidden entry was dated May 1865, written in careful script that showed signs of grief, the letters not quite as steady as in the earlier journal. I write this from a camp along the trail west, 3 weeks into our journey. Elizabeth and Rebecca are buried in Kansas, 2 more victims of the cholera that swept through our wagon train. I should have known better. As a doctor, I understood the risks of traveling through areas where disease lingered. But I believed we could outrun the war, outrun my past, and start fresh in the Western Territories. Instead, I have lost everything that mattered. The irony is bitter. I preserved so many lives during the war, yet could not save my own family. Amos had to stop reading. He looked at the tintype photograph he'd brought down with him, at Elizabeth's gentle face and Rebecca's bright eyes. Both gone before they could reach the new life Dr. Winters had promised them. The next entries detailed the doctor's arrival in Colorado, his purchase of the land, his initial attempts to build a homestead. The writing was mechanical, as if Dr. Winters was going through motions without feeling. Then came an entry from September 1865 that changed in tone. A family arrived at my door today, a Negro man, his wife, and their 2 children. They had been traveling for weeks, fleeing Missouri, where former Confederate soldiers were terrorizing freed slaves. The woman had been beaten. The younger child was sick with fever. I treated them both, gave them food and shelter for the night. Before they left, the man asked if I knew of safe places further west. I told him I did not, but in truth, I am beginning to wonder if this remote property might serve such a purpose. Amos read faster, the pieces clicking into place. By October 1865, Dr. Winters had made contact with others involved in helping freed slaves move west, an extension of the Underground Railroad that had operated during the war. The Colorado Territory was attracting settlers of all kinds, including freed people seeking land and opportunity far from the violence of the reconstructed South. November 1865, I have made my decision. This land, which I purchased intending to hide from the world, will instead become a way station for those seeking freedom and safety. The barn's location, 8 miles from town, provides privacy. The root cellar I discovered, sealed and dry despite the river's proximity, offers secure storage for supplies. I will use my medical skills to tend those injured during their journey. Perhaps in helping them, I can find some redemption for the family I failed to protect. The entries over the next year detailed Dr. Winters' activities. He helped dozens of travelers, freed slaves, their families, occasionally others fleeing violence or persecution. He treated injuries, provided food and shelter, gave them supplies for the journey ahead. He was careful to keep his activities secret, telling townspeople only that he occasionally provided medical services. March 1866. Today I treated a man who'd been shot by bounty hunters, former slave catchers who now claim to be enforcing vagrancy laws, but are really just continuing their old trade under new names. The bullet had shattered his shoulder blade. It took 3 hours of surgery to extract the fragments and reconstruct what I could. He will live, but his arm will never fully recover. When he thanked me, I told him no thanks were necessary, that healing is what I was meant to do. But inside I felt the old anger. The war was supposed to end this. Instead, it merely changed the names we use for cruelty. Amos paused, thinking about the Confederate medical kit. Dr. Winters had continued his practice of using equipment from both sides, treating everyone equally. Even here, far from battlefields, his conscience had remained his guide. The entries continued through 1866, documenting Dr. Winters' growing network of contacts. He corresponded with others running similar way stations. He developed methods for keeping his activities hidden from the townspeople who might not approve. He even created the false bottom in the crate where he kept his journals, understanding that written records could be dangerous if found by the wrong people. Then came the entries from early 1867, and the tone changed again. January 1867. Word has reached me that Colonel Hastings, the officer who threatened me with court-martial, has been asking questions about my whereabouts. His service during the war ended in disgrace after he was found to be profiting from the sale of army supplies. Now he works as a claims investigator, which seems to be a polite term for a man who shakes down former soldiers for money. I suspect he believes I have wealth worth stealing, or perhaps he seeks revenge for my defiance of his orders. Either way, his interest in me is deeply troubling. February 1867, Hastings has written to the territorial marshal, claiming I may have stolen army property during my service. This is absurd. Every instrument I own was either mine before the war or was purchased properly after my discharge. But Hastings has connections and credibility I lack. The marshal has written to me asking about my medical equipment. I fear this is only the beginning. March 1867. I have learned through my contacts that Hastings is not working alone. He has partnered with former Confederate officers who are hunting down people they claim aided escaped slaves during the war. They use legal pretenses to seize property and assets. My work here, helping freed people travel west, would give them perfect justification to destroy everything I have built. I must protect not only my own possessions, but also the network of people depending on this way. Station. The final hidden entry was dated April 10th, 1867, just 2 days before Dr. Winters was last seen in town. I have made arrangements. The most important items, my medical instruments, the money I have saved, and these journals, are sealed in the cellar. The Johnson family, whom I helped last month, has agreed to accept legal transfer of the property. They will claim they purchased it from me and I moved back east. This will protect them and ensure the way station continues. As for me, I will disappear. Let Hastings and his associates believe I fled in fear. Better they chase a ghost than trouble the good people I have been helping. This land will serve its purpose long after I am gone. Perhaps someday someone will find what I have hidden and understand why I did what I did. Amos sat back overwhelmed. Dr. Samuel Winters hadn't disappeared because he was a coward. He'd sacrificed everything, his identity, his home, his chance at peace, to protect others. The next morning, Amos rode to Martha's store before it opened. She took one look at his face and knew he'd found something important. "Come upstairs," she said, leading him to her living quarters above the store. "Tell me everything." He showed her the hidden pages and explained what he'd learned. Martha listened in silence, occasionally reaching out to touch the papers, as if confirming they were real. "My God," she whispered when he finished. "Dr. Winters was a hero." He was. And nobody knows it. The town thinks he was just another settler who disappeared. But he gave up everything to keep people safe. Martha stood and walked to her window, looking out at the street below. "Amos, this changes everything. If you go public with this, it will rewrite the history of this region. It could also cause problems. And what kind of problems? There are still people who don't want to acknowledge what happened during and after the war. People who'd rather forget that the Underground Railroad extended into the Western Territories. And there are descendants of slave catchers and Confederate sympathizers who won't appreciate their ancestors being painted as villains. Truth doesn't care about feelings. No, but truth can be dangerous to the person telling it." She turned to face him. "Henry Pruitt isn't the only problem you face. Once this story gets out, you'll have historians, journalists, government officials, all wanting access to those artifacts. Some will want to preserve them. Others will want to claim them for museums or private collections. You'll be in the center of a storm." Amos had already thought about this. "I know, but I can't keep it hidden. Dr. Winters preserved these things, so someone would eventually find them and tell his story. I think he knew he was writing for the future. What do you want to do?" "I want to honor his memory. Turn the property into a memorial. Make sure people know what he did." Amos paused. "But first, I need to find out what happened to the Johnson family. If they took over the property legally, there might be descendants with a claim to the land." Martha's face brightened. "Peterson can help with that. He has access to all the old census records and property transfers. If the Johnsons had descendants, we can find them. They spent the morning making plans." Peterson would search for Johnson family records. Martha would begin quietly documenting everything Amos had found, creating an inventory that could stand up to legal scrutiny. And Amos would continue securing the property, knowing that once the full story came out, there would be no going back to his quiet life. As Amos prepared to leave, Martha caught his arm. "You know Henry Pruitt won't give up just because you found a noble purpose for the land. If anything, he'll fight harder. A historical site means government funding, development, tourism. That's money he'll want a piece of. Let him try. I've got the law on my side now. And more importantly, I've got the truth." Riding back to the ranch, Amos felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. He was 63 years old, with more days behind him than ahead. But maybe those remaining days could matter in a way his previous life never had. Clara was waiting when he arrived, and Amos spent the afternoon telling her the whole story. The way a man talks to a loyal companion who can't judge but always understands. By the time he finished, the sun was setting over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "We're going to see this through, girl," Amos said, scratching Clara's ears. "For Dr. Winters, for the people he helped, and maybe for ourselves too." Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled. Clara's ears pricked up, but she didn't seem frightened. Amos took that as a good sign. They'd faced worse than wolves. They could face whatever came next. Sleep remained elusive. Amos lay on his bedroll in the house, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Dr. Samuel Winters. The man had sacrificed everything, had staged his own disappearance to protect people he barely knew. That kind of courage seemed impossible in the modern world, where most men, including Amos himself, spent their lives seeking comfort and avoiding risk. Around midnight, unable to rest, Amos lit his lantern and returned to the cellar. He'd read the hidden journal pages 3 times already, but something nagged at him. A detail that didn't quite fit. Dr. Winters had written about transferring the property to the Johnson family, but the county records showed the land reverting to territorial control for unpaid taxes just a few years later. What had happened to the Johnsons? Why would they abandon a property that had been gifted to them? Unless they'd never actually taken possession. Amos pulled out the original journal again, the one that had held the hidden pages. He examined it by lamplight, looking for anything he might have missed. The binding had been opened once to hide the loose sheets. Had it been opened before that? Was there anything else concealed in it? He ran his fingers along the leather cover, feeling for irregularities. The front cover seemed normal, but the back cover felt slightly thicker, as if his pulse quickened. Using his knife, he carefully separated the inner lining of the back cover from the leather exterior. The old glue gave way easily and something fell out, a folded piece of paper sealed with wax. The wax bore an imprint, the initials SW pressed into it with what looked like a signet ring. Amos's hands trembled as he broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The script was Dr. Winters, but hasty, as if written in a moment of urgency. "To whoever finds this, and I pray someone eventually will, know that what I have done was done freely and with full understanding of the consequences. The story told by my previous entries is true, but incomplete. The whole truth is more complex and more dangerous than I could safely commit to regular journal pages. If you have found this letter, you deserve to know everything." Amos sat down on the cellar floor, his back against the stone wall, and continued reading. "The Johnson family never took possession of this property. That was a fiction I created to protect both them and the work being done here. The truth is that this way station was part of a network far more extensive than I initially understood. When I agreed to help freed people traveling west, I believed I was acting independently. I learned later that I had become part of an organized effort spanning from Mississippi to California, funded by abolitionists in the East and supported by sympathetic citizens throughout the territories." Amos paused. This was bigger than he'd imagined. Dr. Winters hadn't been working alone. He'd been part of an organized resistance that continued after the war ended. The money hidden in the cellar came from this network. Donations from those who believed in our cause, meant to support the way stations and help travelers start new lives in the West. I was entrusted with nearly $1,000 over 2 years, a fortune. I used much of it for supplies and assistance, but saved $300 as an emergency fund. That money does not belong to me. It belongs to the cause. And should anyone find it, I ask that it be used to continue helping those in need. $1,000. Amos had found $300 in the cellar. That meant Dr. Winters had already distributed $700 to people who desperately needed it. The doctor had been managing a significant operation. The reason I staged my disappearance is more complicated than fear of Colonel Hastings alone. In March 1867, I learned that our entire network had been compromised. A former associate, motivated by greed and bitterness, had begun informing federal authorities about our activities. Dozens of way stations were being investigated. Several operators had already been arrested on charges of harboring fugitives, a charge that still carried weight despite emancipation. As authorities found ways to reframe old laws for new purposes, Amos felt a chill. The danger had been real and immediate. I received word that Hastings and others were coming to Broken Bluff specifically to arrest me and seize the property. If I was arrested, everything hidden in this cellar would be found and confiscated. The medical instruments I'd used to heal hundreds, the journals documenting our work and the names of those we'd helped, the money belonging to the network. All of it would be lost or worse, used against innocent people. The letter continued, Dr. Winters explaining his plan in detail. He'd arranged for his horse and wagon to be found abandoned, staging what looked like a sudden disappearance. In reality, he'd left on foot, carrying only essential supplies, heading north into Wyoming territory under an assumed name. I left behind everything that connected me to Samuel Winters. My instruments, my journals, my personal effects, all sealed in the cellar I discovered shortly after purchasing the land. That cellar, with its remarkable ability to stay dry despite the river's flooding, seemed like providence. A gift allowing me to preserve what mattered while protecting myself and others. But the most stunning revelation came in the final paragraph. I write this final letter in April 1867, knowing I may never return. The man called Samuel Winters will cease to exist after today, but the work will continue. I've made arrangements with others in the network to ensure way stations remain operational, and I have left instructions that this land should be allowed to return to territorial control, ensuring it remains undisturbed until it is safe to reveal its true history. When that day comes, whether in 5 years or 50, I hope whoever finds this will understand that some secrets must be kept not from cowardice, but from courage. The letter ended with a postscript that made Amos's breath catch. The tintype photograph in the cellar shows my beloved Elizabeth and Rebecca. But if you look carefully at the back of the photograph's frame, you will find one more thing I could not bear to leave behind. One final truth about who Samuel Winters really was. Amos's mind raced. He'd found the tintype, had looked at it several times, but he'd never examined the frame carefully. He scrambled to the crate where he'd placed the photograph, pulled it out, and turned it over. The frame's backing was sealed with paper and glue, standard for tintypes of that era. But at one corner, the paper had lifted slightly, as if someone had pried it open and attempted to reseal it. Amos worked at it gently with his knife, peeling back the paper backing. Behind it, folded small and pressed flat, was another photograph. This one showed Dr. Winters. Amos recognized him from his earlier research of old newspapers, standing with a group of people. Black men, women, and children, about 20 in total, all looking directly at the camera with expressions of hope and determination. On the back of this photo, in Dr. Winters' script, the first group we helped reach California, August 1866. This is why I did what I did. This is who Samuel Winters really was. Amos sat in the cellar, holding both photographs, and finally understood. Dr. Samuel Winters hadn't just treated people or given them supplies. He'd led them to safety. He'd risked everything not once, but repeatedly. For people, the law said he had no obligation to help, and then he'd walked away from his own identity to ensure that work could continue without him. The weight of this discovery pressed down on Amos. This wasn't just a story about a disappeared doctor. This was a story about an organized resistance movement that had operated in secret for years after the Civil War ended. A movement that powerful people had tried to destroy. Were those powerful people still out there? Were their descendants? Would revealing this truth endanger anyone today? Amos thought about Henry Pruitt and his aggressive attempts to acquire the property. Was Pruitt simply a greedy land speculator, or did he know something about what lay hidden here? And what about the riders who'd circled the barn at midnight? Were they common thieves or something more sinister? For the first time since finding the cellar, Amos felt genuine fear. Not for himself. He was an old man with little to lose, but for what might happen if he mishandled this responsibility. Dr. Winters had trusted that whoever found his legacy would know what to do with it. That was a heavy burden to place on a 63-year-old drifter who'd spent the last 5 years of his life making one bad decision after another. But maybe that's exactly why Dr. Winters' story resonated so deeply. Both men had lost everything that mattered. Both had been forced to choose between comfort and conscience. And both had discovered that redemption doesn't come from erasing the past, but from honoring what it taught you. Amos climbed out of the cellar as dawn was breaking. Clara stood waiting, as always. He walked over to her and rested his head against her neck, feeling the warmth of the only family he had left. "It's bigger than I thought, girl," he said quietly. "This isn't just about one man's story. It's about a whole network of people who risked everything to do what was right. And now we're the ones who have to decide what to do with that knowledge." Clara's warm breath on his shoulder felt like encouragement. Or maybe like a reminder that he wasn't alone, even if it felt that way sometimes. The sun rose over the ranch, painting everything in shades of gold. Amos stood there with Clara, looking at the land that had seemed worthless to everyone else, but had turned out to hold more value than any of them could have imagined. Not monetary value, though there was that too, but something deeper, something that spoke to what it meant to be human, in a world that often seemed to have forgotten the meaning of the word. He had decisions to make, big ones, but first he needed to talk to Martha and Peterson, needed to find out if the Johnson family had living descendants, needed to understand the full scope of what he'd inherited when he spent his last $500 on a flood-ravaged ranch, because Amos Tyne was beginning to understand that he hadn't bought this land. The land had bought him, had reached out across decades and claimed him for a purpose he was only beginning to comprehend. Martha's face went pale when Amos showed her the sealed letter and the hidden photograph. They were in her upstairs parlor, the documents spread across her dining table, morning light streaming through lace curtains. "This changes everything," she whispered. "This isn't just local history. This is nationally significant. The Underground Railroad extending into the West, funded operations continuing after the war. Historians have theorized about this, but there's never been concrete evidence, which means it's going to attract attention we may not want," Amos said. He'd been thinking about this all night. "Once word gets out, we won't be dealing with just Henry Pruitt anymore." "No," Martha agreed. "We'll be dealing with universities, museums, government agencies, possibly even the Smithsonian. And not all of them will have pure motives." Peterson, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up. "I found something yesterday. Something you both need to see." He pulled out a folder of documents. "I tracked down the Johnson family descendants. They're in Denver, 3 generations removed from the people Dr. Winters tried to help. And they have letters, original correspondence with Dr. Winters that was passed down through the family." "Letters?" Amos leaned forward. "What kind of letters?" "Instructions, mostly. Dr. Winters explaining how the property transfer was supposed to work, why it was important that they claim no knowledge of the way station, how they should respond if questioned by authorities." Peterson pulled out photocopies he'd made. "But there's also this." He handed Amos a copy of a letter dated May 1867, a month after Dr. Winters' disappearance. The handwriting was different from Dr. Winters, less refined but still clear. "Dear Marshal Keller," Amos started, then stopped. "Keller? Like Sheriff Keller?" "His grandfather," Martha said. "He was territorial marshal back then." "Keep reading." "Dear Marshal Keller, we write to inform you that the Negro family known as the Johnsons did not, as rumored, receive property from Dr. Samuel Winters. We acquired our homestead in Utah Territory through legal purchase and have no knowledge of Dr. Winters' whereabouts or activities. The property in question near Broken Bluff was abandoned by the doctor, and we never took possession of it. We ask that you close any investigation into this matter and allow us to live in peace with our children. Respectfully, Thomas Johnson, They protected the secret, Amos said softly. Even after Dr. Winters disappeared, they stuck to the story. There's more, Peterson said. The Johnson family kept records because they were afraid, rightly, that their descendants might need proof they'd obtained their land legally. Those records include a detailed account of what Dr. Winters actually did. How many people he helped, where they went, how the network operated. It's all there. Martha stood and walked to her window, arms crossed. The Johnsons are willing to testify? They want to, Peterson said. They've been waiting for decades for it to be safe enough to tell the truth. They think now might be that time. It might also be the worst possible time, Amos said. Henry Pruitt filed his legal challenge 2 days ago. The hearing is set for next week. If we bring the Johnsons in now, we're opening up everything to scrutiny. And Pruitt's lawyers will argue that the historical significance of the property means it should be seized by the territory for public preservation. Can they do that? Peterson asked. They can try, Martha said. There are precedents for the government claiming historically significant sites. If they can prove the artifacts and the property itself have major historical value, they could argue that private ownership isn't appropriate. Amos felt a surge of anger. So we're back to the same problem. People wanting to take what Dr. Winters carefully preserved, but for different reasons this time. Pruitt wants money. The government wants credit. Either way, the story gets controlled by people who don't understand what it cost to create. Then we need to control how it comes out, Martha said firmly. We need to present this at the hearing on our terms, with our narrative, before anyone can twist it into something it's not. Over the next 6 days, they worked like people possessed. Martha drafted a comprehensive historical brief documenting Dr. Winters' life and work. Peterson gathered every relevant legal document, including the original land grant from 1865 and proof of Amos's legitimate purchase. Amos carefully catalogued every item in the cellar, photographing each artifact and creating detailed descriptions. The Johnson family arrived from Denver 3 days before the hearing. Thomas Johnson's great-great-grandson, William Johnson, was a schoolteacher in his 50s with his ancestors' same careful manner and clear eyes. He brought 3 generations of family documentation, letters, journals, oral histories recorded and preserved. My great-great-grandfather never forgot what Dr. Winters did, William said, sitting in Martha's parlor with the documents spread around them. He helped our family escape Missouri when former Confederate soldiers were burning out black homesteaders. Dr. Winters not only treated my great-great-grandmother's injuries but gave them supplies and directions to a safe route west. He asked for nothing in return. Why didn't your family come forward earlier? Amos asked. William's expression grew somber. Fear. Even decades after the war, it wasn't safe. People who'd been involved in the resistance were still being persecuted. My grandfather tried to tell the story in the 1920s, but he received threats. Someone burned his barn. He learned to stay quiet. We all did. But you're willing to come forward now? We have to. This is our history too. And if we don't tell the truth, people like your Mr. Pruitt will write whatever version of history serves their purposes. Sheriff Keller stopped by the ranch that evening. He'd been keeping a distant watch on the property since word of the court hearing spread. Now he sat on Amos's porch, hat in his hands, looking troubled. My deputy told me you've been having more visitors at night, Keller said. Riders circling the property, people trying to peek in the barn windows, I've noticed, Amos said. Clara stood nearby, as vigilant as always. I can post someone here if you want. No visual protection. That might draw more attention than it's worth. Maybe. Keller was quiet for a moment. My grandfather was territorial marshal during the time Dr. Winters was here. I found some of his old journals in my mother's attic. He wrote about the Winters case, about how something didn't add up about the disappearance. What did he think happened? He thought Dr. Winters staged it. Thought the man was running from something, but did it smart enough that nobody could prove anything. My grandfather respected that. Keller looked at Amos directly. He also wrote that he suspected Dr. Winters was helping escaped slaves, but he had no proof and wasn't sure he wanted any. Said some laws deserved to be broken. Your grandfather sounds like a good man. He was. And I'd like to think I learned something from him about when to enforce the letter of the law and when to honor its spirit. Keller stood. Whatever happens at that hearing, Amos, know that you've got at least one person in this town who thinks you're doing the right thing. The night before the hearing, Amos couldn't sleep. He sat in the barn with Clara, running through everything they'd prepared. The artifacts were carefully packed, ready to be presented as evidence. The documents were organized. The Johnsons were prepared to testify. Martha had even contacted a historian from the Colorado Historical Society who'd agreed to provide expert testimony about the significance of the findings. But Amos kept thinking about Dr. Winter's final letter. The man had hidden this story for a reason. He trusted that whoever found it would know when the time was right to reveal it. Was this the right time? Or was Amos about to betray that trust by exposing everything to the harsh light of legal proceedings and public scrutiny? "What do you think, girl?" he asked Clara. "Am I doing right by him?" Clara, as always, offered no judgment, just companionship. That simple presence that reminded Amos he wasn't completely alone in this fight. He thought about Sarah, about what she would have said. She'd always believed in standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Especially when it was difficult. Courage isn't about not being afraid, she used to say. It's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. Tomorrow, in front of a judge, lawyers, townspeople, and probably reporters from Denver, Amos would have to stand up and defend not just his ownership of the property, but the entire legacy of a man who'd given everything to help others. It was a responsibility he'd never asked for, and certainly didn't feel qualified to handle. But maybe that was the point. Maybe Dr. Winters had known that the person who found his story wouldn't be a historian or a government official or anyone with power. Maybe he'd known it would be someone like Amos, someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Someone who understood what it meant to be given one last chance at redemption. As dawn broke, Amos washed up, put on his best shirt, which wasn't saying much, and prepared for the day ahead. Martha arrived with her buggy to drive him to town. The Johnsons followed in their own wagon. Peterson was already at the courthouse, ensuring all the paperwork was filed correctly. "You ready for this?" Martha asked as they rode toward Broken Bluff. "No," Amos said honestly. "But I don't think that matters anymore. You're going to do fine. Just tell the truth." That's all Dr. Winters would have wanted. The courthouse was packed when they arrived. Word had spread about the hearing, and it seemed like half the territory had shown up. Amos recognized faces from town, businessmen, farmers, the church minister, even some rough-looking characters who were probably hoping for entertainment. Henry Pruitt sat at one table with two lawyers in expensive suits. They looked confident, almost smug. Pruitt saw Amos enter and smiled coldly. At the other table, Amos sat with Martha and Peterson. The Johnsons sat in the front row of the gallery, along with Sheriff Keller and a few others who declared themselves supporters. The judge entered, Judge Harlan Mitchell, a man in his 60s known for being fair but strict. He looked over the packed courtroom with obvious displeasure. "This is a property dispute hearing, not a theatrical performance," he said sharply. "I expect decorum. Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed." He looked at both tables. "Counselors, are you ready to begin?" Pruitt's lead lawyer stood. "We are, Your Honor." Peterson stood looking nervous but determined. "The defense is ready, Your Honor." Judge Mitchell nodded. "Then let's proceed. Mr. Pruitt, as the plaintiff, you may present your case." And so it began. The battle for the truth about Dr. Samuel Winters and the flood-damaged ranch that had turned out to hold a secret worth more than any amount of silver or gold. Henry Pruitt's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Caldwell, began with confidence. He painted Amos as a drifter who'd stumbled onto a property of significant historical value and was now trying to keep it for himself despite having no legitimate claim beyond a dubious purchase. "Your Honor, my client attempted in good faith to purchase this property before Mr. Tyne's acquisition. The county failed to properly notify interested parties about the tax sale, denying Mr. Pruitt his rightful opportunity to bid. Furthermore, we have evidence that there were outstanding liens on the property dating back to the 1870s that were never properly resolved. This calls into question the validity of Mr. Tyne's deed. Caldwell presented documents that looked official, filled with legal language about unpaid assessments and unresolved claims. Amos watched the judge study them carefully, his expression unreadable. Additionally, Your Honor, we have testimony that Mr. Tyne has been concealing historically significant artifacts on the property. Items that, under territorial law regarding historical preservation, should be declared public property and transferred to appropriate institutions for study and display. Peterson stood. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Pruitt has no standing to make claims about artifacts he's never seen and whose existence he can't prove beyond rumors. Sustained, Judge Mitchell said. Mr. Caldwell, do you have actual evidence of these artifacts? We have sworn statements from townspeople who observed Mr. Tyne acting suspiciously, removing items from the barn, and refusing to allow inspection of the property. Suspicious behavior isn't evidence of historical artifacts. Move on. Caldwell shifted tactics. Very well. Your Honor, we submit that regardless of what may or may not be on the property, Mr. Tyne's purchase was improper. The county clerk, Mr. Peterson, failed to follow established procedures. In fact, we believe there may have been collusion between Peterson and Tyne to ensure the property went to Tyne at minimum bid. Martha whispered to Amos, "That's a serious accusation. They're trying to invalidate the entire sale." Peterson stood again, his face red. Your Honor, that's a baseless accusation. I followed every procedure exactly as required by law. Mr. Tyne's purchase was completely legitimate. We shall see, Caldwell said smoothly. He called his first witness, a county official who testified that certain notification procedures might have been inadequate. The testimony was vague, but created an atmosphere of doubt. Pruitt himself testified next, describing his long-standing interest in the property and his belief that he'd been unfairly prevented from acquiring it. He managed to sound both aggrieved and reasonable, painting himself as a legitimate businessman being blocked by bureaucratic incompetence. By the time Caldwell rested his case, Amos felt the weight of doubt settling over the courtroom. The judge's expression suggested he was taking the claims seriously. The defense may present its case, Judge Mitchell said. Peterson stood, and Amos could see his hands trembling slightly, but his voice was steady. Your Honor, we will demonstrate that Mr. Tyne's purchase was completely legal and proper. Furthermore, we will show that this case is not about property rights at all, but about a man trying to honor a remarkable historical legacy that he discovered by chance. Stick to the legal matters, Counselor, the judge warned. Historical legacies are interesting, but not relevant to property law. With respect, Your Honor, they are completely relevant. Because what we will show is that this property has a clear chain of title going back to 1865, that Mr. Tyne is the rightful owner, and that Mr. Pruitt's real motivation is not correcting procedural errors, but seizing valuable historical findings for his own profit. Caldwell shot to his feet. Objection! That's inflammatory and unsupported. I'll allow it, Judge Mitchell said. But you'd better have evidence to back up that claim, Mr. Peterson. We do, Your Honor. Peterson nodded to Amos, who stood and approached the bench carrying a leather document case. From it, he removed a carefully preserved piece of parchment, yellowed with age, but still legible. This is the original land grant, Your Honor, dated October 15th, 1865, signed by the territorial governor and properly recorded with the county. It transferred the property from territorial control to Dr. Samuel Winters for the sum of $50 and with full legal authority. Judge Mitchell took the document, examined it carefully, held it up to the light. His eyebrows rose. This appears to be authentic. It is authentic, Your Honor, and if you look at the chain of title, you'll see that every subsequent transfer was proper and legal, right up to Mr. Tyne's purchase last month. There are no outstanding liens, No unresolved claims. Mr. Pruitt's allegations are based on misreadings of records that actually show the opposite of what he claims. Caldwell approached the bench. Your Honor, we dispute the validity of this document. It could be a forgery. It bears the territorial seal and the governor's signature, Peterson said. Both can be verified against archives in Denver. We also have supporting documentation, the original survey map, tax records showing continuous payment, and correspondence between Dr. Winters and territorial officials. The judge studied the document for a long moment, then looked at Caldwell. This appears legitimate to me. Unless you have specific evidence of forgery, I'm inclined to accept it as authentic. We request time to have it examined by experts, Caldwell said. Denied. This hearing has already attracted far too much attention. We'll proceed. Judge Mitchell looked at Peterson. Continue with your case, Counselor. Peterson called his first witness, Martha Connolly. She testified about her research into Dr. Winters' history, about the newspaper accounts of his arrival and disappearance, and about the property's legitimate transfer through tax sales over the years. Her testimony was clear, detailed, and compelling. When Caldwell cross-examined her, he tried to suggest her research was incomplete or biased. But Martha held firm, citing specific documents and dates with the precision of someone who'd spent decades managing records and inventory. Mrs. Connolly, Caldwell said with barely concealed frustration, isn't it true that you and Mr. Tyne have become friends? That your testimony might be colored by personal loyalty? It's true we're friends, Martha said calmly. It's also true that every fact I've testified to can be verified through public records. My friendship with Mr. Tyne doesn't change historical documentation, the courtroom murmured approvingly. Even Judge Mitchell seemed impressed by her unflappable demeanor. As Martha stepped down, Amos felt the first stirring of hope. They were holding their own. The land grant had been a turning point, and Martha's testimony had established the historical facts. Now came the harder part, revealing the full truth about what Dr. Winters had done and why it mattered. Peterson called Amos to the stand. As he walked to the witness chair, Amos caught Henry Pruitt's eye. The man's expression was cold, calculating. This wasn't over yet. Judge Mitchell looked at Amos over his spectacles. Mr. Tyne, please state your full name for the record. Amos Jonathan Tyne, Your Honor, and you purchased the property in question for $500 at a county tax sale. Yes, sir, I did. Tell the court what you found on that property. Amos took a breath. This was it. The moment where Dr. Winters' carefully guarded secret would finally see the light of day. He hoped he was doing right by the man's memory. I found more than land. Your Honor, I found a story that needed to be told. Amos described finding the concealed cellar, Clara's strange behavior that had led him to the loose floorboards, and his discovery of the sealed crates. He spoke slowly and carefully, aware that every person in the courtroom was hanging on his words. The first crate contained medical instruments. Your Honor, a complete surgical kit from the Civil War era. Every piece marked with the initials SW for Samuel Winters. The second crate held more medical supplies, including Confederate equipment. The third contained silver coins, Liberty-seated dollars from the 1860s. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Mitchell banged his gavel. Order. Mr. Tyne, continue. But the most important things I found were the journals. Your Honor, Dr. Winters kept detailed records of his life, his work, and his reasons for hiding everything. Amos pulled out the leather-bound journal and the hidden pages. These tell the real story. Peterson approached. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to read selected passages from these journals into the record. Caldwell objected immediately. Your Honor, these alleged journals haven't been authenticated. They could be fabrications designed to create a sympathetic narrative. We have a handwriting expert prepared to testify, Peterson said. And we have corroborating documentation from another source. But the journals speak for themselves, Judge Mitchell considered. I'll allow it provisionally, but I reserve the right to strike the testimony if authentication becomes an issue. Peterson read passages from the journals, Dr. Winter's battlefield experiences, his conflicts with Colonel Hastings, his decision to leave the army, and the tragedy of losing his family. The courtroom fell silent as the story unfolded. When Peterson read the entries about Dr. Winters helping freed slaves travel west, several people gasped. This was history that had been hidden for decades, now emerging in a dusty courtroom in front of people who'd never imagined such things had happened in their own territory. And finally, Peterson said, the hidden letter Dr. Winters left for whoever found his legacy. He read the letter in its entirety, including the revelation about the photograph and the network of way stations. By the time he finished, several people in the gallery were wiping their eyes. Even Judge Mitchell looked moved. Though he maintained his judicial composure, Caldwell stood for cross-examination. Mr. Tyne, these are remarkable stories, but stories nonetheless. How do we know these journals are genuine? How do we know you didn't fabricate them to justify keeping valuable artifacts? Because I'm not the only one who knows this story, Amos said. Dr. Winters made sure of that. Peterson nodded to the gallery. William Johnson stood and approached the witness stand. The courtroom buzzed with curiosity as this well-dressed black man took the oath and sat down. Please state your name and occupation, Peterson said. William Arthur Johnson. I'm a school teacher in Denver. And what is your connection to this case? My great-great-grandfather, Thomas Johnson, was helped by Dr. Samuel Winters in 1866. Our family has preserved letters and documents from Dr. Winters for over 60 years, waiting for the time when it would be safe to tell the truth. William produced the letters, and Peterson had them entered as evidence. The correspondence between Dr. Winters and Thomas Johnson confirmed everything in the journals. The way station, the network, the deliberate fiction about property transfer. All of it. Dr. Winters saved my family's lives, William said quietly. And not just physically. He gave them hope, direction, and resources to start over. My great-great-grandfather became a successful farmer in Utah. My grandfather was the first black county clerk in that territory. My father was a lawyer. I'm a teacher. None of that would have been possible without Dr. Winters. Why did your family keep this secret for so long? Peterson asked. Because it wasn't safe. Even after Reconstruction, even after decades passed, there were people who wanted to punish anyone who'd been involved in helping freed slaves. My grandfather tried to tell this story in the 1920s. Someone burned his barn and left a note warning him to stay silent. We learned to keep our history private. Caldwell's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. The letters were clearly authentic, the dates matched, and William's testimony had the ring of absolute truth. Judge Mitchell called for a recess. The courtroom emptied slowly, people talking in hushed, urgent tones. Amos sat with Martha and Peterson, too emotionally drained to speak. When the hearing resumed, Judge Mitchell looked grave. This court has heard extraordinary testimony today. Testimony about a man of remarkable courage and principle, and about a dark chapter in our nation's history that many would prefer to forget. He paused, looking directly at Henry Pruitt. Mr. Pruitt, I find your challenges to Mr. Tyne's purchase to be without merit. The land grant is authentic, the chain of title is clear, and there is no evidence of procedural impropriety in the tax sale. Your claim to the property is denied. Pruitt's face reddened, but he said nothing. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am persuaded by the evidence that the artifacts found on this property are of significant historical importance. However, I also find that Mr. Tyne discovered them legally on land he owns outright, and therefore they are his property to dispose of as he sees fit. Caldwell stood. Your Honor, we move that the property be declared a historical site subject to territorial oversight. Denied. Mr. Tyne has demonstrated nothing but good faith and respect for the historical significance of his findings. I see no reason to strip him of his property rights. Judge Mitchell looked at Amos. However, Mr. Tyne, I would strongly encourage you to work with historical preservation societies to ensure these artifacts and this story are properly preserved for future generations. That's my intention. Your Honor, Amos said. Then this hearing is concluded. Mr. Tyne's ownership is confirmed, and the property will be protected from further legal challenges. The historical record presented today will be preserved in the court archives. He banged his gavel. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in applause. Martha hugged Amos. Peterson shook his hand vigorously. William Johnson approached with tears in his eyes. Thank you, William said. You've given my family's story back to us. You've honored Dr. Winters in a way we never could have done alone. Henry Pruitt stormed out without a word, his lawyers following. Amos watched him go, feeling not triumph but relief. It was over. The battle was won. Sheriff Keller approached, smiling. My grandfather would have been proud to see justice done today. For Dr. Winters, and for everyone he helped. As people filed out, still talking excitedly about what they'd learned, Amos stood in the empty courtroom for a moment. He thought about Dr. Samuel Winters, who'd given up everything to help people he barely knew, who'd hidden his story in a cellar, trusting that someday someone would find it and understand, that someone had turned out to be a broken-down cowboy with a donkey and $500 to his name. But maybe that's exactly who Dr. Winters had been waiting for. Someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain from doing the right thing. 2 months after the hearing, Amos stood in the doorway of the restored barn, watching the sun set over land that had finally begun to heal. The mud had dried and been cleared. Grass was growing where there'd been nothing but silt. The barn itself stood straight and sound, its new boards blending with the old in a patchwork that spoke of renewal rather than replacement. Inside, the cellar had been transformed into a small museum. The medical instruments were displayed in glass cases that Martha had helped him acquire. The journals, carefully preserved behind protective glass, were open to pages that told Dr. Winters' story in his own words. The silver coins remained in their leather pouches, labeled with cards, explaining their connection to the Underground Railroad network. But the most important addition was the photograph, enlarged and framed, hanging on the wall where everyone who visited could see it. Dr. Samuel Winters, standing with the 20 people he'd helped reach California, their faces full of hope, determination, and dignity. A reminder that history was made not by the powerful, but by the brave. Clara stood in her stall nearby, contentedly munching hay. She had a new brass nameplate mounted on the stall door. Gleaming in the lamplight, Clara, friend and guide. Amos had commissioned it from a metalworker in Denver, wanting to honor the companion who'd been with him through everything. You knew there was something special about this place, didn't you, girl? Amos said, walking over to scratch between her ears. Somehow you knew. Clara's response was to lean into his touch, her warm breath a familiar comfort. The sound of wagons approaching drew Amos outside. Martha arrived first, followed by Peterson and his wife, then Sheriff Keller and several townspeople. The Johnson family had made the trip from Denver. William, his wife Sarah, their 3 children, and William's elderly mother, who'd wanted to see the place her grandfather had spoken of with such reverence. Today was the official dedication ceremony. The Territorial Historical Society had sent a representative, a scholarly woman named Dr. Catherine Wells, who specialized in post-Civil War history. She'd been ecstatic when she first saw the artifacts and journals, calling them the most significant find related to the Underground Railroad in the Western Territories. As people gathered, Amos felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, wasn't comfortable with speeches and ceremonies. But Martha had insisted, and the Johnsons had asked, so he'd agreed. Dr. Wells spoke first, explaining the historical significance of what had been preserved. She talked about how Dr. Winters' journals filled gaps in the historical record, how the artifacts provided tangible evidence of the courage and compassion that had defined that era's resistance movements. Then William Johnson spoke, his voice thick with emotion as he described what this discovery meant to his family. For generations, we've carried this story in whispers and private letters. Today, we can finally speak it aloud. Dr. Winters didn't just save my ancestors' lives, he gave them dignity, hope, and a future. That's a debt no amount of gratitude can repay. When it was Amos's turn, he stood awkwardly, hat in his hands, looking at the assembled crowd. Familiar faces looked back. Martha, who'd believed in him from the start. Sheriff Keller, who'd protected him when he needed it. Peterson, who'd fought for him in court. And the Johnsons, who'd trusted him with their family's precious history. "I'm not much for speeches," Amos began. "Most of my life, I've been better with horses and cattle than with words. But I want to say something about Dr. Samuel Winters and about what this place represents." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When I bought this land, everyone thought I was a fool. Maybe I was. I spent my last $500 on a flood-damaged ranch that nobody wanted. But what I found here was worth more than any amount of money. I found a story about a man who gave up everything, his career, his identity, his chance at peace, to help people who had nowhere else to turn." The crowd was silent, listening. Dr. Winters could have stayed comfortable, could have ignored the suffering around him, but he chose differently. He chose to risk everything for what was right, and when the time came to protect what he'd built, he walked away from his own life to keep others safe. Amos looked at the restored barn, thinking about the hidden cellar beneath it. This land has been underwater twice, abandoned for decades, considered worthless by just about everyone. But it survived. And what was hidden here survived too, waiting for someone to find it and tell the truth. I think Dr. Winters knew that eventually someone would. Maybe not in his lifetime, maybe not even in the next generation. But someday, he met William Johnson's eyes. That someone turned out to be me, a broken-down cowboy with nowhere else to go, and a donkey who's smarter than her owner. But maybe that's exactly who was supposed to find it. Because I understand what it means to lose everything and need a second chance. I understand what it means to be written off as worthless by people who don't see your value. Martha wiped her eyes. Several others in the crowd did the same. "This barn isn't just a museum," Amos continued. "It's a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort. That hidden stories deserve to be told. That land some folks called worthless can hold more value than all the silver in Colorado." He looked around at the faces of his friends, because that's what they'd become, these people who'd stood with him. Dr. Winters left a message in that cellar. He left it for whoever would find it and understand. The message wasn't about the artifacts or the money. It was about integrity, about standing for something when it costs you everything, about trusting that doing right matters, even when nobody's watching. Amos put his hat back on. "I don't know if I've honored his memory the way he deserved, but I've tried. And I'll keep trying for however many years I've got left. This place will stand as a testament to Samuel Winters and everyone he helped." "That's a promise." The crowd applauded, and then there were refreshments. Martha had brought enough food to feed twice as many people. Children ran around the yard, their laughter a sound this property hadn't heard in decades. The Johnson family toured the museum, William's mother touching the display cases gently, tears streaming down her face as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Amos found himself standing alone with Clara, watching the celebration continue around them. "We did it, girl," he said quietly. "We found the story and we told it. Dr. Winters can rest easy now." Clara nuzzled his shoulder, and Amos smiled. He thought about Sarah, about how she'd always said a man needed purpose. For years after her death, he'd thought his life was over, that he had nothing left to contribute. He drifted from place to place, making bad decisions and squandering what little he had. Then he'd spent his last $500 on land everyone said was worthless. And in doing so, he'd found not just a home, but a calling. He'd discovered that his story wasn't over. It was just beginning a new chapter. The ranch, that had been mocked and abandoned, now hosted visitors almost daily. School groups came to learn about history. Descendants of other families, helped by the Underground Railroad network, made pilgrimages to see the place their ancestors had passed through. Historians came to study the artifacts and journals. and each visitor left understanding that courage and compassion weren't just historical concepts, but living values that still mattered. Amos was 63 years old. His back still ached in the mornings, and his hands still complained when rain was coming. But he woke each day with purpose, with work that mattered, with a story to tell and a legacy to protect. He'd arrived at this ranch with nothing but a donkey and $500, considered a fool by everyone who knew him. Now he stood on land that had taught him what he should have known all along, that sometimes the things everyone else considers worthless are exactly what hold the most value. That second chances come when you need them most. That redemption isn't about erasing your past, but about honoring what it taught you. As darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, Amos walked back to the house with Clara ambling beside him. Tomorrow would bring more visitors, more stories to share, more work to do. But tonight, he was simply grateful for this land, for these friends, for the chance to matter in a way he'd never expected. The treasure hadn't been what was hidden in the barn. The treasure was what the barn had helped him discover about himself. And that, Amos reflected as he settled in for the night, was worth more than all the silver in the world.